So if you want to actually solve a city's homelessness crisis, the very first thing you might have to do is entirely abolish your zoning laws.
Which is a wild thing to even consider, right?
It's completely counterintuitive. I mean, think about it for a second. If you live in a major coastal city, you've probably voted for bond measures.
Oh, absolutely. Billions of dollars.
Right. You've paid higher taxes to fund new shelters. And yet, you're probably walking past larger encampments today than you were, say, 5 years ago.
And you're just wondering why none of it is actually working.
Exactly. You might just assume the problem is, well, that it's outpaced the local government's ability to even comprehend it, let alone solve it. But today, in this deep dive, we are looking at a place that did the seemingly impossible.
Yeah, we're talking about Greater Houston, Texas.
Because over the last decade, Houston pulled off this staggering 63% drop in its counted homeless population.
Which, just to put that in perspective, is the steepest decline of any of the 10 largest U.S. cities. I mean, it's basically the exact mirror image of the spiraling crisis we're watching play out across places like California and the broader West Coast.
It's totally upside down.
Right. And the thing is, they didn't do it by simply out-carrying other cities. They did it by out-managing them and, crucially, outbuilding them.
And that is exactly what we are deconstructing today. So we've put together this massive dossier of public data. We're pulling from HUD reports, plus independent journalism from CBS News, Smart Cities Dive, and the Kinder Institute at Rice University.
Yeah, it's a ton of material. But our mission here isn't just to, do a victory lap for Houston.
Not at all. We are taking a real scalpel to what's known as the Houston model. We want to carefully separate the brilliant, highly disciplined management steps that any other city could theoretically copy tomorrow.
From Houston's sheer geographic and structural luck.
Exactly. Things like boundless cheap land and their famously non-existent conventional zoning code.
Because if you're a voter or a taxpayer or just someone trying to navigate your own urban environment, understanding the actual invisible mechanics of how a city tackles a massive social crisis, it fundamentally shifts your perspective.
It really changes what you demand from your local leaders.
Yeah, and it exposes exactly where your tax dollars are getting bottlenecked.
So we need to set our baseline first. To understand a 63% drop, we really have to look at where Houston started. And looking at the HUD data from back in 2011, I mean, it was grim.
It was incredibly bleak.
The regional point-in-time count for that year found roughly 8,900 people experiencing homelessness across the greater Houston area. At that point, they were ranking among the absolute worst big city rates in the entire country.
Right, they were near the very bottom. But you fast forward to the 2024 and 2025 numbers, and that count has just plummeted to around 3,325 people.
Which is a transformation that a lot of municipal leaders genuinely thought was a statistical impossibility.
Oh, yeah, they thought it was fake.
And I actually have to push back immediately on this, too, because whenever a city or a politician claims a 63% drop in anything,
especially something as notoriously fluid as homelessness.
Right. My first instinct is always that they just found a clever new way to count. I mean, is this just a massive flaw in the point-in-time census?
That's a super valid question.
Because counting people who are transient, who might be, sleeping in a car one night and a friend's couch the next, or hiding in abandoned structures, that seems incredibly imprecise.
Your instinct is spot on, honestly, and any serious data analyst would tell you the exact same thing. The point-in-time count, or the PIT count, is this mandated HUD exercise where volunteers basically go out with flashlights and clipboards on a single night in January to just count whoever they can find.
Which sounds totally prone to error.
It is inherently imperfect. I mean, it's a one-night snapshot. It's always going to undercount the true hidden scope of the issue. Like, if it's raining that night, the count might drop just because people found better places to hide.
Which means relying solely on that snapshot to claim a massive victory is pretty dangerous.
It would be, yeah, if that were the only metric they had. But Houston's claim isn't just based on that snapshot. It's actually corroborated by a much more rigorous, undeniable statistic, which is the flow.
The flow. Okay, explain that.
So since 2012, Houston's coordinated system has permanently housed more than 32,000 individuals.
Okay, wait, stop right there. 32,000 people physically moving from the streets or temporary shelter beds into actual permanent apartments.
Yes. And that is a documented physical movement of human beings that independent journalists, like teams from CBS News, have literally verified this on the ground.
Wow.
You can't fake 32,000 signed leases. But here's the thing. The sheer volume of those placements isn't even the most powerful piece of this data.
What's the most powerful metric then?
The retention rate. Roughly 90% of those 32,000 people were still housed, or they had achieved a positive exit to other stable living situations at the 2-year mark.
Wait, a 90% retention rate after 2 full years. That honestly feels like the quiet rebuttal to the oldest, most pervasive skepticism people have about homelessness interventions.
How do you mean? Like the public perception?
Yeah, exactly. Talk to anyone on the street, and there's this very common, very visceral assumption that if you just hand the keys to an apartment to someone who has been chronically homeless, they just won't be able to keep it.
Right, the idea that they'll trash the place or just leave.
The assumption is that the underlying untreated issues, whether that's severe, untreated schizophrenia, profound trauma, or, active drug addiction, that it will inevitably blow up their life again, and they'll end up right back on the sidewalk in a matter of months.
That is absolutely the dominant narrative. The belief that the lack of a house isn't actually the core problem, it's just merely the final symptom of a deeper personal crisis.
But if 90% of them are still in those apartments 2 years later, that totally flips the narrative. I mean, it proves Houston wasn't just shuffling people from encampments into temporary emergency shelters to make the sidewalks look clean for the nightly count.
No, they actually emptied those temporary shelters into permanent homes, and the vast majority of those human beings stabilized.
That's incredible.
It proves empirically that housing stability is the necessary foundation for everything else. But you don't achieve a 90% retention rate, and you certainly don't move 32,000 people through a system without fundamentally blowing up the way that system operates.
Right, you can't just keep doing business as usual.
Exactly. The real story of Houston isn't just these staggering numerical outputs. It's the invisible bureaucratic plumbing they had to install underneath the city to make those outputs even possible.
Which brings us to the actual governance. Because if we go back to that pre-2012 landscape, before this massive turnaround, the way these services were managed was just staggering.
It was a mess.
Looking at the reporting, system is honestly the wrong word for it. It was a fragmented, chaotic mess of dozens upon dozens of well-meaning nonprofits, charities, and religious organizations.
Which, to be fair, is exactly what almost every other major American city looks like right now.
That's true. But in 2011, Houston, each one of these individual organizations had its own intake process, right? Its own unique wait list, its own highly specific criteria for who they deemed worthy of help.
And, crucially, its own siloed grant money that they were fiercely protecting.
Yes. I was trying to put myself in the shoes of someone actually living on the street in Houston back then. You are essentially forced to navigate a bureaucratic maze while in a state of severe trauma.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
You go to Agency A, and you fill out a stack of paperwork recounting all your trauma, only to be told you don't qualify because you don't have a child. So you literally walk 2 miles to Agency B, fill out the exact same paperwork, and they say they can help, but their wait list is 6 months long.
And from a macro efficiency standpoint, it was a complete disaster. You had 100 different organizations competing against each other for the exact same pool of federal HUD dollars and local philanthropic grants.
They weren't coordinating at all.
Not even a little. They were hoarding data. So you could easily have a scenario where one highly proactive individual is being served by 3 different agencies simultaneously.
Like getting food from one, a bed from another.
And case management from a third. While a severely mentally ill person on the very next block is completely invisible to all of them.
It's like having 100 different youth soccer teams all thrown onto the exact same field, all chasing the exact same ball. They're just bumping into each other, exhausting themselves, and entirely failing to actually score a goal.
That's a perfect analogy. And what Houston did starting around 2012 was basically blow the whistle, stop the game, and force all 100 of those separate teams to merge into one single professional franchise.
With one playbook.
With one playbook, or they literally wouldn't be allowed on the field at all.
So that pivot in 2012 is the defining moment. When Mayor's office looked at the crisis and realized that sprinkling money across 100 isolated, uncoordinated programs was basically just burning cash with zero systemic return.
Right. They recognized they didn't need to fund more individual shelter beds. They needed to fund a pipeline to permanent housing, coordinated across every single provider in the region.
And that unified regional command structure they created is called the Way Home.
Yes. In HUD terminology, this is the continuum of care, or COSI. Houston's is designated COSI TX 700. But the Way Home isn't just a government agency.
No.
It's a massive coalition that forcibly welded together over 100 different partners. We're talking about private homeless service agencies, the city of Houston itself, Harris County, the Public Housing Authorities, the local Department of Veterans Affairs, and all the major philanthropic funders.
Okay, here is where I really have to pause and look at the politics of this. Because it sounds amazing on paper, but human nature and institutional ego make this incredibly difficult.
Oh, yeah, it's a bureaucratic nightmare to set up.
How on earth do you convince 100 independent nonprofits to just surrender their turf? These are organizations with their own boards of directors, their own branding, their own annual gala dinners, and their own localized power structures.
They like being in charge.
Right. You're asking them to give up control of their individual grant applications and submit to a central authority. Why would any established charity agree to that?
You're identifying the exact friction point that stops this from happening in almost every other city. Nonprofits, by their very nature, are fiercely protective of their autonomy and their funding streams. To break that resistance, Houston had to use the absolute ultimate leverage, centralized funding. They didn't just ask nicely. They appointed a backbone agency, like an air traffic control center called the Coalition for the Homeless of Houston-Harris County, or the CFTH.
So the CFTH essentially becomes the enforcer.
Precisely. The CFTH was chosen to run the shared data systems, to submit the massive annual collaborative application to HUD on behalf of the entire region, and most importantly, to coordinate the distribution of all the funds.
They held the purse strings.
They pooled all the money, not just the federal HUD dollars, but local government funding and massive corporate and philanthropic donations from heavy hitters like the Houston Endowment, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, and Chevron.
So they completely cornered the market on the money. If a charity wanted to keep the lights on, they had to go through this central hub.
Simple governance changes stop service competition when you control the purse strings. The rule became absolute. The dollars follow the unified plan. If you, as a nonprofit executive, want access to this massive pooled funding, your agency has to comply with the central strategy set by the Way Home Steering Committee.
It completely ends the era of the loudest, most charismatic, best-connected grant writer winning the money for their boss's pet project.
Exactly.
The funding is directed strategically to where the unified system dictates it is needed most. If you want to play by your own rules, you don't get the team gear.
It forced compliance. And yes, there was a ton of friction. Some agencies initially balked, but eventually the sheer financial gravity of the unified COSI pulled almost everyone into orbit.
Getting everyone to agree to a unified plan is a massive political victory. But a plan is just a piece of paper, right? Executing it day in and day out across a sprawling metropolis requires entirely new operational tools.
It requires what the researchers call the copyable plumbing of the Houston model.
The plumbing. I love that term. And there are two massive pieces of this plumbing we need to dissect: coordinated entry and the by name list.
These are the daily operational mechanisms that actually make a unified system function. Without them, the unified governance is just a series of pleasant meetings.
Let's start with coordinated entry. In practical street-level terms, what does this actually change?
Think back to the maze you described earlier. Coordinated entry is the bulldozer that flattens the maze. It establishes one single standardized front door for the entire region.
Okay.
Today, anyone entering the system anywhere in Greater Houston, whether they walk into a massive downtown shelter or they're engaged by a street outreach worker under a highway overpass, they are assessed using the exact same standardized triage tool.
So they only have to tell their story once.
They do an intake exactly once. The data goes into a shared central system. And then the system matches that specific individual to the right intervention, rather than having the individual guess which agency they belong to.
That makes so much more sense.
The intake worker treats the entire city's housing resources as one giant menu, and they order exactly what the person needs, regardless of which specific nonprofit actually operates that specific housing.
That shifts the entire burden of navigation off the shoulders of the person in crisis and puts it onto the back-end software. Which leads us directly to the second, perhaps most vital piece of the plumbing, the by name list.
Yeah, this is huge.
The dossier defines this as a live, shared roster of every known homeless person in the region, complete with their specific needs and vulnerabilities.
The by name list is transformative because it completely changes the psychology of how a city views the crisis. It takes this overwhelming, massive, abstract concept of the homeless problem, which always feels unsolvable, and turns it into a finite, workable checklist.
You're not just throwing resources into a black hole anymore.
Right. You aren't trying to solve a generic crisis. You are trying to house a specific number of known individuals.
But I want to really dig into the mechanics of this because it's easy to throw around terms like by name list and assume it's just magic. Ultimately, a by name list is just a giant shared spreadsheet on a secure server.
Right, it's just data.
So how does knowing someone's name actually build an apartment or put a roof over their head?
You are entirely correct that a list by itself does nothing. A list is just surveillance unless it is strictly tied to action. In Houston, the list is weaponized to dictate the triage.
Weaponized how?
Because the COTAC has centralized funding and coordinated entry, when a subsidized apartment or a housing voucher becomes available anywhere in the city, the system doesn't just hand it to whoever happens to be standing in the lobby that morning.
It doesn't go to the person who is simply the easiest to find or the most compliant?
No, not at all. The system consults the by name list. The list is ranked by a strict vulnerability index. The system knows exactly who is next in line.
Okay, I see.
They know that John Smith has been living unsheltered for 5 years, that he has severe untreated diabetes, and that he is statistically at the highest risk of dying on the street this winter. So when that apartment opens up, the Central Command dispatches outreach workers with the specific mission to go find John Smith.
That is a massive paradigm shift. The spreadsheet essentially enforces
It
fairness.
strips out the bias.
Right. It ensures that the most chronic, the most difficult, the most resource-intensive cases aren't just bypassed by agencies who might secretly want to cherry-pick quick, easy wins to boost their quarterly metrics.
It literally dictates the physical movement of resources to the most vulnerable human beings. The by name list data is the safety net that prevents individuals from falling through system cracks.
Because in the old fragmented system, John Smith falls through the cracks because he's too sick and too tired to advocate for himself.
Exactly. In a coordinated system, John Smith is at the absolute top of a digital dashboard that every major agency in the region is staring at every single day, until a caseworker marks him as housed.
And they can track progress, subgroup by subgroup, right? They can look at the list and say, okay, we have exactly 412 veterans experiencing homelessness today. Let's direct our next block of federal funding to zero out that specific list.
Yes, it makes the goal actually achievable.
But knowing exactly who needs a home is really only step one. Step two is getting them into that home without making them jump through impossible hoops. And that brings us to the core philosophy driving all of this physical movement. The concept of housing first.
Housing first is the engine block of the Houston model. And we need to be very, very precise about what it means because it is probably the most misunderstood term in urban policy today.
It gets thrown around a lot.
It really does.
Yeah.
Housing first means putting people into their own permanent subsidized apartments first and then wrapping the necessary supportive services around them.
Services like psychiatric care, addiction treatment, employment counseling, and basic health care.
Yes. You deliver those services to the individual in the stability of their new home, rather than requiring sobriety or a clean drug test or what the industry calls treatment readiness as a precondition for getting the keys to the apartment.
I want to break down the actual types of housing we're talking about here, because the system obviously isn't a one-size-fits-all. The outline distinguishes between two main housing paths: rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing.
Yeah.
How does the by name list triage you into one versus the other?
It all comes back to that vulnerability assessment. Rapid rehousing is essentially short-term rental assistance. It's designed for people who have fallen into homelessness due to a sudden, acute financial shock.
Like a medical emergency or something.
Exactly. Think of a family where the primary earner lost their job, or someone who got hit with a massive unexpected medical bill and got evicted.
So they don't necessarily have severe underlying behavioral health issues. They literally just ran out of money.
Right. They don't need years of intensive wraparound social work. They just need a temporary financial bridge, maybe 6 to 12 months of rent support, to get back on their feet, stabilize their income, and exit the homelessness system entirely. Rapid rehousing is high velocity and relatively low cost.
And then on the other side, there's permanent supportive housing.
Permanent supportive housing, or PSH, is the heavy artillery. This is for the chronically homeless and the severely disabled. These are the highly vulnerable folks we were talking about earlier, the ones at the absolute top of the by name list.
At John Smith.
Exactly. PSH provides a long-term, sometimes lifelong, rental subsidy, and it pairs that subsidy with intensive, ongoing on-site services.
This brings us to a massive societal debate, and is one we really need to look at impartially because it is the ideological battlefield where a lot of these policies die in other cities.
Oh, it's a huge point of contention.
A lot of people across the political spectrum look at the housing first model and feel a profound visceral discomfort. They argue that handing over a free, subsidized apartment to someone who is actively struggling with severe, untreated addiction, or who is in the middle of a profound psychiatric crisis without asking them to engage in treatment first, is fundamentally backward.
They feel like you're enabling the behavior.
Right. The societal instinct is almost always to say, we will give you the housing as a reward once you get clean or once you comply with the program. How did Houston justify completely ignoring that deeply ingrained societal instinct?
It is the defining pushback every single city faces, and Houston was definitely not immune to it. They faced intense political and social pressure to bolt sobriety requirements back onto the housing process.
I can imagine.
But they maintained rigid, absolute fidelity to the housing first model. And their justification for ignoring that societal instinct wasn't ideological at all. It was purely empirical. They just looked at the data.
They pointed back to that 90% retention rate we talked about.
Precisely. The data proved that solving the physical, geographical state of homelessness first creates the baseline physiological and psychological stability required to actually treat the addiction or the mental illness.
It makes sense when you spell it out like that.
If you think about it from a purely practical medical standpoint, how can you reasonably expect someone to get sober to manage a complex daily regimen of psychiatric medication or to search for employment when they're literally sleeping under a tarp?
When they are terrified of being assaulted in their sleep, when their belongings are constantly being stolen, and when they're constantly being moved by police sweeps.
The sheer stress and trauma of mere survival consume 100% of their cognitive bandwidth. Houston's disciplined adherence to housing first is a key management step that other cities can replicate, provided they have the political courage to actually stick to it.
They realize that housing isn't a reward for getting well. Housing is the critical medical intervention that makes getting well physically possible.
Exactly.
But there is a glaring missing piece here. Even with centralized funding, even with flawless coordinated entry, a perfect by name list, and a philosophical commitment to housing first, you still need physical apartments to put these people into.
You need inventory.
The government of Houston doesn't just own 32,000 empty apartments, which means they have to rely on the private market. They have to convince private landlords to let formerly homeless individuals move into their properties.
And this is the make or break mechanism of the entire operation. It is what they call the landlord hustle. The whole system lives or dies on landlord engagement.
Yeah, critical.
Oh, absolutely. You can have the most accurate by name list on the planet, but if you do not have a network of private landlords willing to accept the housing vouchers and take a calculated risk on these tenants, the whole machine grinds to a halt. You just end up with a waiting list of people holding useless pieces of paper.
I try to put myself in the shoes of a mid-level property manager. You have a fiduciary duty to the building owner. A caseworker comes to you and asks you to rent a unit to someone who has a history of eviction, no credit score, and who has been living on the street for 3 years. The perceived risk is astronomically high. How does Houston convince them?
By heavily mitigating that risk financially and operationally, Houston relentlessly recruits landlords, treating them not as adversaries, but as VIP clients of the COSI.
VIP clients.
Yeah. They offer upfront financial incentives just to sign the lease, but more importantly, they offer robust risk mitigation funds. They provide written guarantees that if a tenant damages the unit or if they break the lease, the system will just cover the financial loss.
Oh, so the landlord isn't left holding the bag.
Exactly. And they go a step further, which is brilliant. They provide a dedicated 24/7 hotline exclusively for landlords.
Like a bat signal.
Kind of. If a formerly homeless tenant is having a mental health crisis at 2 a.m. and causing a disturbance, the landlord doesn't have to call the police and initiate a messy eviction. They call the hotline, and the KCOSI immediately dispatches a crisis response team and a caseworker to the building to stabilize the tenant.
They make it economically safe and operationally painless for the private market to participate.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's synthesize everything we've covered so far. We have this incredibly impressive, disciplined, highly coordinated machine. The centralized governance, the coordinated entry, the by-name list, the strict fidelity to housing first, the aggressive landlord recruitment. All of this is theoretically entirely copyable.
Yes.
Any mayor in any city in the country could listen to this, hire the right consultants, and say, we are implementing the exact same software and management structure.
In theory, yes. The governance and the plumbing are 100% replicable.
So if that is true, why hasn't a city like Los Angeles or San Francisco or Seattle achieve the exact same 63% drop.
It's the million-dollar question.
These are cities with massive budgets, deep progressive commitments to social services, and some of the smartest policy minds in the world. Why is the West Coast crisis growing exponentially while Houston's shrank? This brings us to the absolute elephant in the room. Geographic luck and real estate economics.
This is where we have to introduce the core thesis that underpins this entire deep dive. It is a concept that researchers emphasize really heavily. Individual vulnerabilities like mental illness, trauma, and addiction largely determine who falls into homelessness.
Okay.
But the cost of housing and the overall supply of housing set the scale of homelessness in any given region.
Let me repeat that, because it is the master key to understanding this entire crisis. Personal illness and addiction determine who becomes homeless, but the systemic cost of housing determines how many people become homeless.
Precisely. If you have a region where housing is cheap and abundant, a person struggling with severe addiction might still be able to afford a cheap room in a boarding house or a low-end apartment.
They're struggling, but they're indoors.
Right. But in a region where housing is incredibly scarce and expensive, that same person is immediately priced out onto the street. And this is where Houston is playing the game on a completely different difficulty setting than the coastal cities.
Because Houston has a superpower when it comes to real estate.
Yes. Houston is famous in urban planning circles for being the only major U.S. city with virtually zero conventional use-based zoning laws.
That's zero.
Pretty much. They don't have the vast tracts of land strictly mandated for single-family homes that you see in Los Angeles. Furthermore, the city sits on essentially flat, abundant, seemingly endless Texas land. It spans across massive, massive counties.
So what does that mean in practical terms for a developer?
It means the regulatory friction is incredibly low. If a developer wants to build a multifamily apartment complex, they don't have to spend 5 years fighting neighborhood vetoes, attending hostile town halls, and navigating labyrinthine environmental reviews.
How does it build it?
You can build faster, denser, and exponentially cheaper in Houston than almost anywhere else in the country. Which means they have what economists call an elastic housing supply. When the population grows or demand goes up, developers simply build more housing, which keeps the baseline prices relatively low across the entire market. And this is the critical connection. When the baseline cost of a regular market rate apartment is lower, every single downstream government intervention becomes dramatically cheaper too.
The public dollars go further.
The dollars stretch infinitely further. To truly understand this gap, we need to look at the jaw-dropping statistics comparing the cost of construction. Let's look at what it takes to build one single unit of permanent supportive housing from scratch.
Okay, give me the numbers.
Let's look at Los Angeles. Under their voter-approved Measure HH, which was a massive bond to build supportive housing, the cost to build one single unit has routinely run well north of $600,000.
$600,000 for one unit.
It gets worse. For some projects that have been under construction recently, the cost has spiked up to roughly $765,000 to build a single unit.
Wait, I need to make sure I am hearing that correctly. $765,000. And we are talking about what is essentially a 500-square-foot studio apartment for one person.
Correct.
That is roughly $1,500 per square foot just for construction. You could buy a sprawling, multi-bedroom estate in huge parts of the American Midwest or the South for the cost of one tiny supportive studio in California.
And unfortunately, the math gets even worse.
How could it get worse?
Building the unit is only the upfront capital cost. When you factor in the ongoing operating costs, which run about $17,000 a year to provide the wraparound psychiatric and medical services, plus the building maintenance, a single Los Angeles unit can have a life cycle cost nearing $840,000 over a 20-year period.
I am honestly trying to process the sheer scale of that expense. If I am the mayor of a coastal city facing an encampment crisis, is it even physically or mathematically possible to build my way out of this at those prices?
I mean, mathematically, no.
Even if I have $1 billion budget, at $750,000 a door, I'm going to run out of money long before I run out of people on the street.
That is the tragedy of the math. High housing costs permanently trap cities in a cycle of homelessness because the public purse simply cannot compete with the inflated realities of the real estate market. Expensive land creates an impenetrable barrier for building new supportive housing.
So if a coastal city perfectly copied every single piece of Houston's brilliant governance tomorrow, if they set up the absolute best continuum of care, a flawless by-name list, and mandated strict housing first, It wouldn't matter.
Well, it would help them become vastly more efficient with the resources they do have. It would stop people from falling through the cracks. But ultimately, their budget would simply hit a brick wall.
The money wouldn't stretch.
Their dollars would buy a fraction of the housing supply that Houston's dollars buy. Houston can build and lease supportive housing for pennies on the dollar compared to Los Angeles because the fundamental unit economics are radically different.
It really forces you to reframe the entire Houston miracle narrative. It isn't just a story of genius bureaucracy. It is a partnership of two massive forces.
That is the most accurate way to view it. Cheap, elastic housing supply sets the ceiling on how bad the problem can possibly get in your city. The superb, highly coordinated management system determines how close you can drive that number down to zero.
And Houston has both.
Houston is the beneficiary of the best of both worlds. They have the cheap geographical ceiling, and they built a highly efficient bureaucratic machine to capitalize on it.
So if you are a city planner or an advocate in San Francisco or Boston, you can copy the governance. You can ruthlessly unify your nonprofits. You can mandate the centralized funding and the by-name list, but you cannot copy the geography.
No, you can't.
You cannot manifest cheap, unzoned land out of thin air.
You cannot. And this forces a really uncomfortable reckoning for these expensive coastal cities regarding their land use policies. Houston's lack of zoning allows for rapid construction and small lot development.
Right.
Coastal cities, on the other hand, are paralyzed by layers of environmental reviews, strict single-family zoning, prevailing wage requirements, and neighborhood associations that weaponize the legal system to block affordable housing.
The NIMBYism is real.
Until those structural, real estate, and regulatory barriers are dismantled, governance reform alone will never allow them to match Houston's numbers.
Which is a deeply sobering reality for anyone living outside of Texas.
Nah.
But I want to bring the focus back to Houston today, because as brilliant as their system is, and as remarkably cheap as their land is, the ground is starting to shift underneath them.
Things are definitely changing.
Fast forward to right now, looking at the 2023 to 2025 timeline, and even Houston's well-oiled machine is starting to rattle under severe new pressures. Let's look at the 2025 point-in-time numbers, because they are not a victory lap.
No, the 2025 PIT count presents a very sobering picture that has a lot of advocates deeply concerned. The overall count of people experiencing homelessness in the region is basically flat compared to 2024. It went up by just 45 people, totaling 3,325.
Okay, flat isn't inherently terrible. I mean, it means they at least held on to that massive 63% cumulative drop. They didn't rubber band back to 2011 level.
That is the silver lining. The historical decline is holding. But when you lift the hood and look closely at the composition of that 3,325 number, the alarm bells start ringing really loudly.
What's the breakdown?
The number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, meaning people who are visibly living on the streets, in tent encampments, or sleeping in their cars, rather than utilizing temporary shelters, is up roughly 15.8%.
A nearly 16% jump in visible street-level homelessness is significant. That is the kind of increase that residents and business owners notice immediately.
And it gets more concerning when you look at the vulnerability of that population. Chronic homelessness among that unsheltered group, the hardest to reach, most vulnerable folks we discussed earlier, jumped from 29% of the unsheltered population in 2024 up to 44% in 2025.
So the steep, decade-long downward curve has clearly stalled out.
It has stalled.
So we have to ask, what is breaking down? Is the machine failing, or is the environment around the machine changing? Looking at the research, there seem to be a few massive structural threats hitting the system all at once. Let's walk through them. The first one is the federal money.
Yes, and this is critical context for understanding their massive success in the early 2020s. A major factor that artificially accelerated Houston's housing placements over the last few years was a massive, unprecedented influx of federal COVID-19 relief dollars.
Oh, right, the pandemic funds.
Millions of dollars flowed into the system, and Houston smartly used that money to supercharge their rapid rehousing programs.
But that money wasn't permanent.
Exactly. Those pandemic-era emergency funds officially expired in late 2024. The spigot has been turned off. It is a severe funding cliff.
But HUD still funds them, right? The federal government didn't completely walk away.
HUD still funds the baseline system. They recently granted the Houston COC over $71 million for the year. But HUD itself has publicly flagged that this baseline grant is simply not enough to sustain the massive infrastructure Houston has built without significant, sustainable local money stepping in to replace those expiring COVID checks.
So the system was essentially supercharged by emergency federal cash. They floored the accelerator, and now the tank is running low. and they are begging the local city and county governments to start paying for the gas.
That's a great way to put it.
What else is threatening the model right now?
The second major structural threat is a severe shortage of temporary shelter beds. The Kinder Institute at Rice University recently released a report showing that Houston currently has the fewest available shelter beds it has had in over 20 years.
Wait, I need to untangle this because it seems contradictory. I thought the entire fundamental philosophy of Housing First was to bypass the shelter system altogether. The goal is to move people directly from the street into permanent apartments. Why does a shortage of temporary shelter beds matter if the ultimate goal is permanent housing?
It is a great question, and it reveals the practical reality of operating this system. Even the most highly efficient Housing First system takes time.
Right.
When a person is assessed and placed at the top of the by name list, they don't get keys to an apartment that afternoon. Finding a willing landlord, securing the physical voucher, conducting the unit inspection, matching the client's specific needs, it can take weeks or sometimes months.
Right. Bureaucracy still moves at the speed of paperwork.
During that 60 or 90-day waiting period, you desperately need a robust temporary shelter floor to catch people. You need a safe place for them to sleep, to keep their belongings secure, and most importantly, to keep them engaged with their caseworkers.
Because if you don't have open shelter beds, that person has to wait for their apartment while living on the street.
Exactly. And when people wait on the street, they deteriorate rapidly, both physically and mentally. Their phone gets stolen so the caseworker can't reach them. They suffer assaults. They self-medicate. The shelter shortage proves that even the purest Housing First model still requires a robust, temporary triage space to hold people safely while the permanent housing is prepared.
So looking at this funding cliff and the shelter shortage, I have to ask the final really critical question here. If Houston is sliding backward, if unsheltered homelessness is up nearly 16%, and chronic street homelessness is spiking to 44%, the very second the federal COVID checks stopped bouncing, was this whole Houston miracle actually a triumph of smart management? Or was it just a temporary illusion created by having a massive one-time pile of federal cash combined with cheap local dirt?
Does the Houston model bend, or does it eventually break under pressure? It is the defining question for the region right now, and the rest of the country is watching closely to see what happens next. To synthesize the opposing views generously, I would argue that the current wobble is primarily a funding cliff, not necessarily a failure of the core strategic model.
So the plumbing still works.
The plumbing we spent all this time discussing, the by name list, the coordinated entry, the triage, it still works perfectly. It still successfully identifies people, it prevents them from falling through the cracks, and it knows exactly how to house them. The problem is not the engine. The problem is that the engine now lacks the fuel to execute the plan at the required scale.
So it isn't a failure of philosophy, but it exposes a massive vulnerability in how we fund these programs.
Exactly. It exposes the extreme fragility of relying on external temporary federal grants rather than establishing dedicated, sustainable local funding streams through municipal taxes or permanent philanthropic endowments. It proves that even the absolute best designed, most efficient bureaucratic machine runs out of gas eventually.
I imagine the skeptics are having a field day with this, though.
Oh, absolutely. Skeptics would argue that Houston's entire narrative of success was overly dependent on cheap land and a once-in-a-century injection of pandemic cash, and that now that the market is normalizing, gravity is taking hold.
And what do the advocates say?
Advocates would passionately counter that without the unified COSI command structure, all that COVID cash and all that cheap land would have been completely wasted. It would have been squandered on competing siloed projects, just like it was in dozens of other cities that received the exact same COVID funding but saw their homelessness numbers continue to skyrocket.
The truth is clearly a messy combination of both. They genuinely built a great, highly efficient engine, but they also happen to have access to incredibly cheap, abundant fuel for a decade. Now the fuel is getting expensive, and we're going to see how well the engine holds up.
Right. Whether the system bends or breaks over the next 3 years will depend entirely on whether Houston's local city council, the county government, and the private philanthropic sector step up to structurally replace those missing federal dollars.
But even with the current plateau and the undeniable 2025 wobble, their achievement over the last decade remains historically significant. We cannot lose sight of the fact that they still sit at a 63% overall reduction from their 2011 baseline.
Which is an incredible piece of context to keep in mind, especially for anyone who feels like this is a hopeless, unsolvable issue.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's summarize exactly what we've learned, because for anyone listening who wants to enact change in their own city, the line between what can be copied and what is pure geographical luck is so incredibly distinct.
If you are looking to advocate for real solutions in your own community, the replicable management steps are clear. You can and you should demand unified governance from your local leaders.
Stop the turf wars.
Yes, you should demand a single continuum of care command structure that stops local nonprofits from competing against each other and forces them to work together under one strategic playbook.
You can demand that your city implement a live, functioning by-name list with coordinated entry so that vulnerable individuals stop falling through the cracks of a fragmented bureaucracy, and so resources are deployed based on actual data, not just who is easiest to reach.
You can demand strict fidelity to the housing first model, getting people indoors and stabilized before demanding they solve their deepest, most complex dramas.
And you can push your local government to fund aggressive, subsidized landlord recruitment to open up the private market.
Those are the tools you can demand tomorrow. But, and this is the harsh structural reality check, you also have to look honestly at your city's zoning laws and its real estate market.
Can't ignore the math.
You cannot import Houston's abundant, unzoned, flat, cheap land. If your city maintains massive regulatory friction, layers of endless environmental review, and exclusionary zoning that makes building a single 500-square-foot studio apartment cost $750,000, you will never match Houston's numbers.
It doesn't matter how good your by-name list is if there are no physical doors to unlock. Which leaves us with a really provocative final thought to mull over as we close out. If geography, restrictive zoning, and fundamentally cheap land are the ultimate, immovable gatekeepers to solving the scale of this crisis, will our most expensive coastal cities eventually have to completely redefine what the word housing even means?
That is the frontier we are rapidly approaching. If you physically and mathematically cannot build a traditional apartment complex for less than $700,000 a unit, you will run out of taxpayer money long before you run out of individuals experiencing homelessness.
So does that mean cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York have to move away from traditional apartments entirely? Will they have to embrace completely unconventional, ultra-cheap architectural models to scale their supply?
Like what?
I'm talking about things like massive neighborhoods of 3D printed homes, sprawling authorized tiny home villages on public land, or radically retrofitting abandoned industrial and commercial spaces into dormitory-style living. Because if they ever want to achieve their own Houston-style miracle, they have to fix the math.
And right now, the math of compassion in places like California is fundamentally broken.
It is a question of geometry and urban economics colliding head-on with human dignity. And how cities answer that question over the next decade will determine the shape of the American urban landscape.
It's going to be fascinating to watch.
It brings us right back to that opening image, the contrast of the two cities, the tents lining the sidewalk under the highway overpass versus the empty temporary shelters. Houston showed the entire country that the bureaucratic maze can actually be untangled.
They proved, with hard data, that 90% of highly vulnerable people will stay housed and stabilized if you just give them a chance and the keys to a door.
They built a machine.
Yeah.
Now the rest of the country has to figure out if they have the political will and the zoning flexibility to afford to run it.